As usual, guys, I'm late to the party. I know, it's just my video recording schedule, but what am I talking about exactly? I'm talking about this new LMHR, plaque begets plaque study by Nick Norwitz. I will admit, I went through the study out of curiosity because someone sent it to me, and I was like, oh, well, I've heard about the study for the last few days, but I haven't really had the gumption to look at it. They sent it to me, and then a few days later, I was like, you know what, I'm curious, and so I looked at it. So I already have an idea of what the study is, and we'll get into my thoughts. I'm not going to give them right now, but I decided that it would be a good idea to do a video on it, to exemplify, just the nuance here and the granular details, because you know how I am with the nuance and the granular details. I love getting deep into that. Anyway, we're going to jump directly into this. We're going to read it very thoroughly, and we're going to say what it can say, and arguably most importantly, what it cannot say, because the limitations of this type of science is arguably more important than, the lack thereof. Let's go ahead and start the screen recording up. I will turn the microphone on for this one, and let's get up here. All right, so plaque begets plaque. ApoB does not. Longitudinal data from the Keto CTA trial. Okay, so in the title, we are looking at longitudinal data, which means it's sort of a prospective cohort study type thing. Prospective cohort studies are a type of observational study where you compare two cohorts and you compare the associations between them. So that's not what this is. This is a strict observational one where they measure one cohort, one population, and just see what's going on. Basically, the population is, well, you know what? Not going to ruin it. Let's get going to the rest of it. So obviously Nick Norwitz had a role to play in this, which is why he's one of the main proponents for the study, and he's one of the main advertisers for it, the main promulgators. I always like looking at the central illustration first, whether or not that's something that I should do. I don't know. I like images more. I like graphics more. Graphs in general. So central illustration, 100 individuals. Okay, so 100 individuals for a longitudinal study. Usually longitudinal studies are done on very large populations, thousands of people, tens of thousands. And sometimes you'll even get in the millions. So 100 people that are genotypically and phenotypically different from each other, with this study being the first of its kind, therefore hasn't been repeated on other populations. Again, lack of evidence is not evidence of lack, whatever. It's just something to keep in mind. It's only 100 people. So please keep this in mind. Exhibiting ketogenic diet induced low density lipoprotein cholesterol elevations. Okay, two threads there. Ketogenic diet induced. Okay, what ketogenic diet are we talking about? Now, this is relevant, and you'll see later on what we're talking about. What type of ketogenic diet is this? Ketogenic diet, that's an umbrella term. It's an umbrella term for any diet that can induce ketosis, basically, okay? You could even be a little more loose with the definition and say any diet that induces ketogenesis, except for the fact that you're always undergoing ketogenesis no matter what, and no matter what diet you're on, and no matter whether or not you're in the fed or fasted state. So actually, yes, you can't be loose with that definition. Never mind. Ketosis-inducing diet. So that could be a plant-based keto diet, that could be a sort of processed food keto sweets type of diet, or it could be a species-appropriate, species-specific diet, that being a certain variation of the carnivore diet, or a carnivore diet. Again, gosh, Eddie, hypocrite! Anyway, okay, but I said there were multiple threads there, so that's the first thread. Ketogenic diet, what type of diet? You'll see why this matters in a minute. Okay, next, low-density lipoprotein cholesterol elevations, okay? To be really pedantic, it's not cholesterol, like I say, but okay, we'll give grace here. We understand what they're saying. Elevations, okay, elevated beyond what, according to who, on the basis of what, as I always say. Why do I ask this? Because is this going off of the mainstream sort of overall guidelines, or is it going off of a certain doctor's office's normative levels? Because when we talk about population, okay, what population are we talking about? Usually when it comes to assessing whether something is abnormal, like high or low in terms of the normative range for a certain blood marker, you're actually talking about the population of that specific doctor's office. Okay, it's either that or they're going off of the mainstream guidelines like the United States, like the NIH or something like that. I think the NIH might actually be the UK. I don't even really care about these authority agencies so much that I don't even know what their titles are. That's an actual fact. I don't even know. But you get my point. So I'm going to assume the latter, actually. But even then, okay, fine. So they took people that are considered to have high LDL. Okay, and they're basically, and it seems to be induced by ketogenic diets, okay, because again, that's another problem, the word induced here. You can't say that the ketogenic diet induced it because there's no guarantee that if they were off that diet, they wouldn't exhibit the same, if not higher, LDL levels. Frankly, that's a fact, because LDL levels are encoded for by your genes and nothing else, and they fluctuate based on so many different factors. So that's important. These people are genotypically and phenotypically different from each other. So actually 3 threats, and we're not even into the graphs yet. All right, so these are, once again, these are the limitations we're talking about. We're followed for 1 year. Okay. How long does heart disease take to develop? A lot longer than 1 year. It doesn't mean that there may have been some plaque progression during that time, but to what degree? Is it of any significance? This is a 1 year long study, okay? Usually these studies go on longer than that. That's why it's a per year of follow-up is what you'll see in the stats, because it goes on for longer than a year, okay? So very limited, this study. Using coronary artery calcium, so CAC score, which only measures calcified plaque, important limitation there, and coronary computed tomography angiography. Okay, so that's going to measure what they call, you can actually see it over here, NCPV, non-calcified plaque volume. So, okay, all right, so they did that. All right, so they measured all types of plaque. Okay, cool. Keto, N equals 100. So we already understand that. HDLC, LDLC, triglycerides. Okay, yeah. So here we go. Here's where we start to get to the numbers. LDLC level on average, 254 plus or minus 51 milligrams per deciliter. Okay. All right. Now, just out of curiosity, since the sample size was small, you can expect a signal-to-noise ratio on all these values that are trending towards the uninformative range. Just for reference, a signal-to-noise ratio, you want it to be, really, if I'm going to give as much grace as possible, you want it to be at least 2. But I think that it's important to aim for about 5 or more. So anyway, let's look at this. 254 divided by 51, and let's see the value. Okay, so 4.98. I mean, that's pretty good. Okay. So roughly, you got a value of 203 to 305. I mean, that's still, there's a range there. As a sort of measure of it, like an actual measure of it, 5 or more is good. So it didn't quite reach 5, but okay. I'm really trying to give as much credit as possible here. For the ApoB levels, and for people that don't understand, ApoB is just a tag that's specifically on LDL that the receptors will actually bind to and will allow cholesterol to be sequestered from the LDLs. They'll sequester it from it after the ApoB binds to the specific transporters on certain cells. So it's a rough estimate of things, of lipoproteins. Anyway, okay. 185 plus or minus 51, so we're going to divide it by 51 and see. Okay, so lower, it's 3.63, but it's greater than 2. That's something. 89 plus or minus 20 for HDL, which, again, none of these really matter. And for people that have watched my videos, or, again, you've read my book, Contrainidicated, link in the description for paperback, hardcover, and audiobook, you already know the etiology of heart disease, and you know that LDL and any of the lipoproteins or subfractional lipoproteins play no role to speak of in the development of it. It's just false. Okay? It's ridiculous. All right. So 89 plus or minus 20 for HDL, 4.45, good. The biggest problem here is actually triglyceride levels, 67 plus or minus 30. So 67 divided by 30, you're going to get a ratio of 2.23, but at least it's greater than 2 for all of these. That's actually surprising for a sample size of 100, frankly. Prospective sort of cohort study, again, it's not a prospective cohort study, it's an observational study. I keep saying that. But anyway, okay, so those are the levels, and then they measured plaque progression via CCTA. Here's where we really get into the nitty-gritty details here, okay? Here are the graphs, okay? Change in total plaque score, all right, versus ApoB. So ApoB in milligrams per deciliter is the independent variable here, and the change in total plaque score is the dependent variable, in their opinion, frankly, because, it sort of implies that they're causally linked, those terms themselves, right? But, okay, here's a line here, and it shows that there's basically no association whatsoever. And at least, here's the thing. There's very clearly no linear association. They're using linear regression here, but oftentimes there are associations that will have very low R values and R squared values, sort of quantifiers for the strength of linear associations. But you'll very clearly see a curvilinear association. It's because it's a different metric. It's a different quantifier. It doesn't necessarily mean there isn't an association. It means there's no linear association if the R value is really low, which is reflected in the line of best fit here that was chosen on this graph here, okay? So there's no linear association. We already know that. However, there's some interesting little behavior here. So there's a few data points at the very low end, which means that the total plaque score changed very little, irrespective of ApoB, in this range for these specific people. Okay, but then it goes up even more. There's a change in total plaque score. It goes up here. But for most of the people in this group here, there is a change in total plaque score of that value, which again, we don't know the specific numbers, so there's no numbers listed. Despite the fact that there's a range from all the way at the very low end for ApoB and all the way at the very high end. Most of it was actually clustered around here in milligrams per deciliter. So that's interesting. You had this, I don't really know what to call this type of relationship at all, but it sort of implies that there is some sort of association to some degree going on, but it's just not a linear one. So really what this shows is that ApoB, it actually reinforces, it still does reinforce, just not in the way I think that it was going for. It reinforces the idea that ApoB really has nothing to do with plaque progression, because no matter what the ApoB value is, you still have people having changes in total plaque score all the way at the very top with one person, at least right in the middle, but two people there, and you can characterize this as, you can characterize each line as a separate sample though, in a way. If the amount of people in each separate sort of conceptual sample is too low to grant enough statistical power, then actually none of these show anything of significance at all. That gets into some statistical analysis stuff. Anyway, that's what this video is about. So anyway, but then let's go to the second graph here. Baseline CAC score. How is the baseline CAC score correlated with the change in non-calcified plaque volume in cubic millimeters? Okay, this is when you get a really strong sort of a line. You get a really strong relationship, positive relationship, linear relationship particularly. However, I have a really big problem with this, okay? This is why statistics gets very complicated for most people. It's not simply about looking at an R value or an R squared value. An R value is a quantifier of how strong a linear relationship is. The value is within a range of -1 to 1. -1 represents a perfect negative linear relationship. The line is just perfect down here, and every data point lines up on the line. Perfect negative association or relationship. 1 is a perfect positive going in this direction. You can sort of already see this in this graph here. 0 is no linear association whatsoever. Okay. So the thing about an R value is if there's a 0, I already talked about, it doesn't mean there's no association. It means there's no linear association to speak of. Okay? And fair enough, fine. But this is why it's still important to look at the actual data points, the graph, the spread itself to see. Where did the R value come from? Show me the graph. Show me the data points on the graph. And then show me the error bars for the standard deviation. All that stuff matters, okay? However, if you have a high R value, same thing. It doesn't necessarily mean, it indicates, oh, strong positive association. But look at this graph here. Where do all of the data points seem to cluster up? At the bottom here. A baseline CAC score, if it was really low, yeah, you had some clustering right here where the change in non-calcified plaque volume was also low. But look at how high it can go. Most of the data points are clustered at the very end of the graph, and some people still had a change in non-calcified plaque volume that was quite high, ostensibly. There's no numbers here, and there's no sort of baseline range. They haven't given that, at least in this graphic here. That may have been intentional. Now, if you take the highest point here of non-calcified plaque volume progression in this sort of cluster sample, again, taking these as separate samples conceptually speaking, and you draw a horizontal line here as a cutoff, there's only 3 points that are higher than that. 2 of them are not significantly higher than this at all, and they end up at the sort of lower end of the x-axis, which is the baseline CAC score. The highest point is clearly an outlier. It's 1 person out of 100, so 1/100th, where they had the highest amount of non-calcified plaque volume, but still on the lower end of the baseline CAC score. This is a really bad data set. This is a really bad data set. I'm sorry. So you have this line here that's drawn for a line of best fit using the sort of, least squares regression formula to calculate that. So sure, you have this line drawn, but it doesn't mean that there's actually sure, that's represented by an R value that shows the strength of the association, but it doesn't mean that the association means anything, because look at where these data points cluster. This is nothing of utility, especially considering that it's still with 100 people, and again, most of the 100 people are clustering at the very bottom. This study doesn't show what the conclusion says it shows, where plaque begets plaque. It doesn't show that. I'm sorry. It doesn't. And again, if you've read my book, you already know how plaque progression occurs. You already know how this occurs, okay? And so you don't need this type of study to even be conducted in the first place to show, oh, well, cholesterol doesn't cause heart disease. Please go. I would suggest waiting till the end of this video for a final point of commentary, though, because there is some utility in the study for other reasons, okay? And we'll get to that at the end. So, anyway, over a 1-year prospective trial conducted on lean, metabolically healthy persons with carbohydrate restriction induced okay, so induced, again, is a cause and effect statement. You don't know if it induced those elevations in ApoB, and again, elevations. I mean, did they compare them before the diet? Because if not, then you can't say that there was an elevation after they started consuming the ketogenic diet, unless they actually just reported that. And again, that's iffy there, because I don't think they would be lying about it, but maybe they would. But also, that would only be able to be inferred if they had a previous blood test within a sort of recent time frame to support that notion. Some people did not, I would suspect, get a blood test done for a lipid panel or a lipid reading with a lipid panel before this study happened and before they embarked upon a ketogenic diet particularly. So anyway, ApoB did not predict plaque accumulation. Baseline CAC and other plaque metrics did predict plaque accumulation. But okay, how did it predict it? Look at these data points. How could you say that? Predicts it within what error range? Seriously. Did predict plaque accumulation, suggesting plaque begets plaque. Well, suggests is an opinion. Okay, that's a value judgment statement, frankly. It doesn't suggest that at all. Whereas ApoB is not a significant predictor of risk in this population. Well, that's true. But again, not because the line of best fit shows, almost a straight horizontal line and, really no association whatsoever, but because, look, line here, line here, line here, like it's not. And each sort of individual line, if they represented a sample, is too small to have any statistical power in the first place, not to mention that it's all across the x-axis in the first place. So yes, it doesn't suggest any relationship at all. In this population of 100 people that are genotypically and phenotypically different from each other, that were studied for 1 year. Keep this in mind, by the way, okay? All right, let's start reading this. We've basically covered the main things of the study, but let's look at the population themselves. Let's see if there's any sort of problems here that would represent limitations. Changes in low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, not cholesterol, among people following a ketogenic diet are heterogeneous or genius. Prior work has identified an inverse association between body mass index and change in LDL-C. However, the cardiovascular disease risk implications of these lipid changes remain unknown, and they always will be in this area of science because this area of science can't inform upon risk because risk is a cause and effect statement, okay? So, objectives. We already know the objectives. 100 individuals exhibiting KD-induced LDL-C. Again, we've already covered that. Greater than or equal to 190 milligrams per deciliter. Okay. High-density lipoprotein cholesterol and triglycerides were followed for 1 year using coronary artery calcium and coronary computed tomography angiography. Okay, results. So also, they're taking people that are exhibiting elevated levels of all of these, HDL and triglycerides. Triglyceride is your biggest indicator, at least in my opinion, because triglycerides are formed at an upregulated rate with higher insulin and higher blood glucose, because that allows you to, higher glucose consumption, which will first of all lead to higher insulin, but also lead you to overeating quite conducively, which is a great subsequent conducive way to cause the other major stimulus of fatty acid synthesis and subsequent triglyceride synthesis, which is an upregulation of ATP production, so a maximum rate of respiration. So there you go, which is the main thing. It causes citrate to migrate into the cytosol and all that. So anyway, diet adherence and baseline cardiovascular disease risk sensitivity analyses were performed. Okay, so we'd have to see how frequently that was done, and also it's based on respondent data. So plaque progression predictors were assessed with linear regression and Bayes factors. Well, so again, linear regression. That begs the question, really. Results, we already know the results. What is the signal to noise ratio on the results? That would be interesting to understand. and whether it was represented as a standard deviation or a standard error. That's also important. Conclusions. In lean, metabolically healthy people on ketogenic diet, neither total exposure nor changes in baseline levels of ApoB and LDL-C were associated with changes in plaque. Linearly associated, first of all, and also, yeah, with ApoB, makes sense. Conversely, baseline plaque was associated with plaque progression. Yeah, we already saw the data points. It's not informative. There are limitations with everything. The R values, linear regressions, there's limitations with all of it. Okay. Supporting the notion that in this population, plaque begets plaque, but ApoB does not. Okay, so even based on the actual etiology of heart disease, this doesn't make sense. Okay, plaque begets plaque. So if you have plaque in your arteries, it acts as a magnet and attracts more plaque. Well, that's not how it works. That's not how it works. There's a reason why I'm not giving the full picture. First of all, I'm trying to save time, but also you can either buy my book to read more. It says it way better than I can in this video in full. And that's the main thing. If I start talking about it, I'm going to get into a huge thing. Okay, but if you want that huge spiel, it's in my book, or I have a playlist. If you don't want to buy the book, I have a playlist on my channel that you can binge, and it's all about heart disease and the etiology of it, usually in the form of reaction videos. So anyway, introduction. I really don't think that we need to read this introduction. I think we're done here. Glycated hemoglobin, less than 6.0%. Okay. So HbA1c is what they're talking about there. Fasting glucose, less than 110 milligrams per deciliter. Okay, well, these could have a role to play because how many of them were within the range of 100 to 110? 110 could be a problem. How many of these people were over-consuming protein? There's so many things that could be a possibility here. Exclusion criteria, yeah, whatever. I don't really care about that in this situation. Sometimes that's important. Statistical analyses, data are presented using the median, 25th to 75th percentile, and mean plus or minus standard deviation for continuous. Okay, so plus or minus standard deviation, sure, but there's no error bars on the graph. And okay, so here we go. Table 1, baseline characteristics. Age 55.3 plus or minus 10.6. These are examples of limitations. Ketogenic diet duration. Okay, so let's look at the signal-to-noise ratio on this. 1,642.7 days, which is inferred by what? Plus or minus a 913.5. Okay, 1,642.7 divided by 913.5. And you get one that's less than 2. So that's just ridiculous. A 1.79, 1.8 signal-to-noise ratio, that's not great, is it? So this diet, these people were on the diet for, a wide range of days. So that's interesting. Body mass index, at least they controlled pretty tightly for that. But again, the body mass index does not discriminate based on what the weight is made up of. So that's another problem. Systolic blood pressure, 121.8 plus or minus 21.1. Okay, so some of these people had higher blood pressure, which is actually a contributing factor to heart disease development. Okay, plus or minus 21.1. Systolic, I wonder how many people were above the 120 range. Because systolic is the top number. 120 over 80 is like the baseline, like that's your goal. Total cholesterol, 355.1. Yeah, well, we don't really care about that, do we? Non-calcified plaque volume. So a lot of these people already had plaque accumulation, which is to be expected on people that weren't consuming great diets beforehand. That's what we're assuming, at least. If it wasn't species appropriate, well, it was contraindicated. At least to some degree, of course. Different variations of indication. It's a spectrum, isn't it? 10-year cardiovascular disease risk. Well, no. Well, also 5.2 plus or minus 5.3. So the noise is greater than the signal. That's great. Total plaque score 1.7 plus or minus 2.6. So the noise swamps the signal almost twofold there. Okay. Diet composition. Carbohydrates 39.5 plus or minus 29.8. Well, that's a problem. So they were also consuming carbs, which contribute to glycation. Okay, no guarantee that these people required like 10 or 20 as a baseline at all. Okay, fat, saturated fat, sugar, which is carbohydrates, so I don't know why they have a different listing for that, because all of it breaks down to that. Unless they're talking about fiber as being a carbohydrate, so fine. There's some nuance there. And then sodium, we don't care about sodium. But if they had higher insulin, I'd like to see their insulin levels as well. I really would like to see that. All right, change in non-calcified plaque volume in millimeters cubed. Oh, so this is measuring the change in the non-calcified plaque volume according to the baseline non-calcified plaque volume. And that, well, there's not really an association there, is there? Same thing with proportional NCP and CP by PAV. That's the method of measurement. So even then, plaque begets plaque, but even in this thing, it doesn't really show that, does it? Okay, really what I think that what they're talking about then is the original graph, which we already covered, and how bad that is. They're talking about calcified plaque volume and how it contributes quote unquote, to non-calcified plaque volume, which again, there's really nothing there to look at. Okay, here's another figure here. Change in ApoB in milligrams per deciliter. So they continuously measure them, apparently. Oh, no, not necessarily. They could have measured them beforehand and then afterwards. So change in ApoB in milligrams per deciliter, and how that relates to the change in non-calcified plaque volume, no association there. Makes sense to me. And then the actual total ApoB in milligrams per deciliter and how that changes, changes is a cause and effect statement. And then baseline CAC, we already seen that graph, we already covered it. It's not good. It is not great. They're clustered all the way at the bottom there. R values are highly influenced by outliers. And it doesn't necessarily mean these are outliers by calculation, but comparatively to where the clusters are, that's something. Change in ApoB in milligrams per deciliter. Okay, so no association there. No association there, even with the confidence interval. Wow, okay, so there's some spread there. That's great. Well, that's to be expected. The baseline CAC and how it contributes to the change in total plaque score. So there's a very slight association there, but still really nothing of significance at all. And then no association here, so I don't even really care about what that is. Not to mention that all of them are clustered at the bottom. So actually, on diet, cumulative LDL-C exposure, milligrams per deciliter, years, okay. Final non-calcified plaque volume in cubic millimeters, yeah, so they're all clustered here. So most people actually had little cumulative LDL-C exposure, and also it still contributed very little to the non-calcified plaque volume level. But wow, look at that. Look at that spread there, though. Look at that. Those gray lines, it represents a confidence interval, I believe. And then, okay, so here you actually have, a proper, so this is a spread that would allow you to look at an R value and say yes or no, whether it's a strong linear association or not. Okay, which is very clearly no, it isn't at all. Okay, so very little associations. The only one here is baseline CAC and change in non-calcified plaque volume. And we already said that most of them are clustering up at the very end. So no, it doesn't really show anything at all. All right. So let's look at the changes here. Okay, yes, you're giving these numbers, but I want to know the standard deviations. Do they give the standard deviations? R squared. Yeah, okay. P-values. All right, so also not even of statistical significance for a lot of these, which is, I know it's an arbitrary cutoff, but still important, I think, to look at. These studies, I'm telling you guys, these studies are really worthless. They really are. Well, there you go. Funding support and author disclosures. Funded by the Citizen Science Foundation. Co-author of a Mediterranean low-carbohydrate diet cookbook. Yeah, that's not good. Sorry, Nick. All right. Well, I think that's pretty much it for the study. The reason I told you to wait till the end is because I just said that these studies really are worthless. When I first read this study, I thought the same thing. I went, oh my God, when will it end? When will it end? And you know what? I still do think that in my head. Like, when will we understand that human nutrition science cannot inform upon things of any utility or significance? A big part of it actually has to do with the ethics. And I'm not saying the ethics are a bad thing. I'm just saying that is a big reason. It's a big obstacle to overcome. However, there actually is utility in studies like this. Since all nutrition science is of this quality, more studies being done like this, just on the opposing side, a ketogenic side, I think is a great way of being able to basically fill up your arsenal with a bunch of mud for reciprocal mudslinging of studies. All these people in the, vegetarian vegan space, the plant-based space, or even just the standard diet space, they throw studies at you. In fact, one of the things about being carnivore is that you will be, when you're debating someone, when you're arguing with someone, you're always on the back foot. You're always on the back foot. And you can try your best to not be, but the problem is that the reason that you're on the back foot is because there has not been a lot of science conducted on this type of diet. And they'll weaponize that against you. Well, look at all these studies that show this, and this, and this, and this. And this shows that meat eating is bad in the context of a standard diet or something like that. You don't have studies to throw back at them, at least to the same degree and the same quantity that they do. And so you're on the back foot. You have to resort to different types of sciences. But what they will do is they will try and frame that as if that's an evasion of science, when in reality, you're just resorting and referring to the hard sciences to make more informative inferences. And so, as much as it is true to say, I'm not playing that game with you, I'm not going to move any of my pieces in the first place because there's no point. This is bred in circuses. This is like a dog with a bone, okay? You're just chasing after a bunch of useless bullshit and you're fighting within this ring-fenced area of nonsense. You're not seeing the forest for the trees here. As much as it's accurate to say that, sometimes it's almost important to be able to play the game for a little bit, to be able to entertain it a little bit. And so this actually does have utility in that regard, Because if someone shows a study that says, oh, this long-term, this like 2-year study that shows this in this population that shows, well, you can throw this back at them. Well, this study shows this. Any study that you show me, I can find a study that will basically point in the exact opposite direction that was conducted the same way within a reasonable error range that basically, forms a different conclusion, indicates a different conclusion. And so we need more studies like this in a way. It would be amazing if we would just stop conducting these, okay? But I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. So it actually may be a good thing that these studies are being done. As worthless as they are, they may actually have some worth, just in ways that we didn't really think of to begin with. So, with that being said, I hope that this was informative. I say I hope because I know that I get technical. It's just who I am. That's kind of what my channel focuses around, is the technicality behind these things instead of the superficial sort of stuff, which there's utility in that too, and there's other channels that will do that. But that's why I say I hope. But if you need to rewind, that's fine. But if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. Come on. It's really easy. It takes 2 seconds. Less than that, actually. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you haven't, what are you doing? What are you doing? And also leave your thoughts in the comment section below. And once again, buy my book, Contrainidicated. It explains things in a way that I can only explain so much in a video. Okay? It goes in very deep depth. And once again, the second edition, which is much better in my opinion to the first, is out now. A link in the description below for the audiobook version, the paperback version, and the hardcover version. Again, I'm working on the ebook. You may have seen that video that I uploaded, I think it was 2 days ago for me, about, why I'm having problems with it. But anyway, with that being said, join me next time when we are reacting to more, study breakdowns. We're reacting to more studies in the first place that don't show anything. Sorry, Nick. Or we're reacting to more inanity online, we're monologuing, whatever it may be. So, look forward to that. Till then.